August 2nd, 2005, Toronto Pearson International Airport, 4:02 p.m. 309 people, one runway, 80 knots into a ravine. The aircraft split apart and caught fire. Everyone survived. They called it the Miracle of Toronto. But 27 years earlier, another plane had crashed into that same ravine. 2 people died. A coroner demanded changes. Nothing changed. How did 309 people walk away from an accident that should never have happened twice? To understand that, we need to go back about 10 hours, to a warm summer morning in Paris, France, where a captain was stepping off a train and walking toward the terminal building at Charles de Gaulle Airport. He felt rested. He felt ready. He had no idea that by the end of this day, his aircraft would be burning in a ditch on the other side of the Atlantic. But something he would say to his cabin crew, a single briefing, almost routine, would end up being the reason that every person on board made it out alive. This is the story of Air France Flight 358. The captain had been flying for over 3 decades. He started in gliders, moved through the military, then spent years at regional airlines before landing at Air France when his previous employer, Air Inter, was absorbed into the company back in 1997. He flew the A340 family first, even became an instructor and a check airman on it. But after a few years, he requested a transfer to the long-haul fleet and was offered a command on the 4-engine Airbus A340 in 2001. When Air France later offered him an instructor position on the type, he declined. He wanted more experience first. His colleagues described him as relaxed, professional, and easy to fly with. The cabin crews adored him for his open communication style. His training record was spotless. By this day, he had logged 15,411 hours total, with 1,788 on the A340. But in recent years, he had started feeling more tired than usual. Medical checkups turned up nothing specific, but Air France had still granted him a reduced roster to make sure he could rest properly between flights. His last trip had been 12 days earlier, so on this morning, walking through Charles de Gaulle, he felt sharp and ready. He arrived at the crew room about 2.5 hours before departure. Half an hour later, the first officer showed up, and it turned out they knew each other from a simulator check ride a few years back. The first officer had taken an unusual path to the cockpit. He started at Air France as a cabin crew member in 1985, spent years building pilot hours on his own time, and finally made the transition to the flight deck in 1997. He had 4,834 hours total, with over 2,500 on the A340. Management and fellow pilots considered him solid and competent. The two of them pulled up the pre-flight paperwork and quickly spotted one detail worth noting: a 30% chance of thunderstorms in the Toronto area later that afternoon. Not alarming, not unusual for a summer day in southern Ontario, but enough to warrant caution. They decided to load an extra 3,000 kilos of fuel, which would buy them roughly 23 minutes of holding time if they needed to wait out weather on arrival. Their flight plan listed Niagara Falls as the alternate, and the extra fuel also gave them reach to several other airports, a smart hedge when thunderstorms are in the forecast, since those storms can shut down multiple airports across a wide area. At the time they checked, the actual weather in Toronto was fine. Clear skies, light winds, nothing to worry about. The crew walked over to brief the cabin team. 10 crew members rostered for the flight. But as it turned out, 3 additional cabin crew were also on board, traveling as passengers in crew seats. Just a scheduling coincidence. Nobody thought twice about it. The captain had never flown with this particular lead purser before, but they hit it off immediately. The briefing was thorough, the mood was good, and soon the entire crew made their way out to the gate where their aircraft was waiting. A gleaming Airbus A340-313, registration F-GLZQ. Built in 1999, 4 CFM56 engines, 6 years old and in solid technical shape, with no major open items in the tech log. It had logged just over 28,000 flight hours across 3,711 flights. The pilots had already agreed on their roles. The captain would fly the departure out of Paris. He needed a takeoff logged to keep his recency current within the 90-day requirement. The first officer would then take over for the cruise and handle the approach and landing into Toronto. 297 passengers filed on board. Business travelers, families, students. The cabin crew counted heads, secured the doors, and confirmed the final number, 309 souls. 2 pilots, 10 cabin crew, 297 passengers. The 3 extra crew members settled into their seats. One was invited into the cockpit jump seat. The other 2 took places in the cabin. At 11:53 UTC, 1:53 in the afternoon Paris time, the giant Airbus pushed back, fired up its 4 engines, and taxied out to runway 09 left. Moments later, Air France Flight 358 lifted off and turned northwest, heading for the Atlantic. Somewhere over the ocean, the crew would receive a small message on their ACARS screen, a weather request for Toronto, returned with 2 words, TAFNIL. No forecast available. They moved on. The Atlantic crossing was routine, but not quite as planned. Before reaching their oceanic entry point, the crew was re-cleared from Track Bravo to Track Alpha, a route further north at a lower altitude. Flight level 350 instead of the planned climb to 370. A longer path, burning more fuel. These reroutings happen often enough over the North Atlantic that they rarely raise concern. But this one quietly ate into that extra fuel the crew had so carefully loaded back in Paris. As the hours passed, the pilots handled the usual rhythm of an ocean crossing, plotting position, monitoring systems, requesting weather updates through the ACARS. And this is where that TFNIL message starts to matter. To understand why, you need to know how pilots build their weather picture during a long flight. They rely on 2 types of reports: the METAR, which tells them what the weather is doing right now, and the TAF, which is a forecast of what it will do over the next several hours. Without the TAF, pilots are essentially flying with one eye closed. They can see the present, but they cannot see what is coming. The reason Flight 358 never received a TAF was buried in a menu. The ACARS system on the A340 had 2 request options, TAF short and TAF long. If the crew simply requested weather through the standard menu, the system defaulted to TAF short. But Toronto was only issuing TAF long. The system found no match and returned nothing. To get the actual forecast, the pilots would have had to navigate into a submenu and specifically request the long format. They did not do this. It was not a mistake born of carelessness. It was a trap built into the interface, a mismatch between what the system asked for and what the real world was providing. And neither pilot had any reason to suspect the system was failing them silently. So for the entire crossing, their weather picture for Toronto remained frozen at that pre-departure snapshot. A 30% chance of thunderstorms. Manageable, unremarkable. Meanwhile, on the ground, the reality was changing fast. Back over the cabin, 297 passengers settled into the rhythm of a transatlantic flight. Window shades drawn against the afternoon sun, meal trays collected, the low hum of 4 engines pushing through thin air at 36,000 feet. None of them knew that thunderstorms were already building along a line northwest of Toronto, stacking up into towering columns of energy that would soon close in on the airport. To understand what was waiting for this crew, you need to know what a thunderstorm actually is, and why pilots treat them like walls of concrete. This is why every airline on Earth has clear rules about avoiding thunderstorms during cruise flight. Stay at least 20 to 30 nautical miles away on the upwind side. Never fly through a red return on the weather radar. The guidance is unambiguous. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that would define what happened to Flight 358. Those rules applied to cruise flight. For approaches and landings, Air France had no such rules at all. The company had actually considered implementing a minimum distance rule for thunderstorms during approach, a standard requiring pilots to break off if storm cells were within a certain range of the airport. They evaluated it after a previous incident, and then they decided against it. The reasoning was that such a rule would impede the pilot's ability to exercise their own professional judgment. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. In practice, it meant that when the pressure was highest, fuel running low, workload climbing, passengers waiting, the pilots had no safety net to lean on. No hard line that said, "Stop here." The decision was entirely theirs, made in real time, under conditions that were actively degrading their ability to decide. If you're enjoying this video and want to see more stories like this one, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, and it means I can keep making these. Now, let's get back to the flight. At 1750 UTC, about 2 hours before landing, the crew sent a message to the Air France handling office in Toronto with an expected arrival time of 1939. The reply came back with their parking gate. What the reply did not include was any mention of the fact that a red alert was now active at the airport. Thunderstorms had moved close enough that lightning strikes had triggered a full ground stop. Fuelers pulled off the ramp, baggage handlers sheltered inside, all ground movement frozen. But the red alert was a ground operations protocol. There was no requirement, no procedure, no checkbox for the handling agent to tell the incoming flight crew that the airport was effectively under siege. So the crew of Flight 358 continued planning their arrival as if the weather was still what it had been hours ago. 30% chance of thunderstorms, manageable. Over the next 40 minutes, the picture slowly sharpened. The crew requested updated weather for their alternate airports and found that thunderstorms were now reported northwest of Niagara Falls, moving southeast, toward them. They switched their alternate from Niagara Falls to Ottawa, which was still clear, but Ottawa was farther away. The math changed. Instead of 23 minutes of holding fuel at Toronto, they now had roughly 14, and that number kept shrinking. At 19:04, the crew messaged their operations office, "If we divert, we are going to Ottawa." A diversion that would mean a 5-hour bus ride for 297 passengers. Investigators later examined whether this inconvenience might have weighed on the pilots' minds. It is impossible to know for certain, but what is known, what decades of human factors research confirm, is that the closer a crew gets to their destination, the harder it becomes to turn away. The cost of continuing feels small in the moment. The cost of diverting feels enormous. This is not weakness. It is how the human mind works, and it is exactly why clear rules exist in aviation, to make the decision before the pressure arrives. Flight 358 had no such rule to fall back on. At 19:15, the area controller told the crew to slow to minimum speed. There were now delays building at Toronto. For any experienced pilot, that is a clear signal. Aircraft ahead are struggling to land, possibly going around, possibly diverting. The weather has gotten worse. The crew of Flight 358 requested and received vectors to avoid storm cells that now towered to 45,000 feet around them, well above their cruising altitude. A few minutes later, the controller said traffic had started flowing into Toronto again, and that Flight 358 could expect further clearance at 1950. But 1950 would push them right up against their fuel limit for diversion. Then, at 1928, the clearance came earlier than expected. They were cleared for the Simcoe 2 arrival into Toronto. The fuel gauge read 9.3 tons. They were 137 nautical miles from the airport. The clock was running. At 1933, the latest ATIS broadcast for Toronto arrived. It was no longer the calm report they had received hours earlier. Now it read, "Severely reduced visibility in thunderstorms and heavy rain. Rapidly changing weather conditions. Runway 24 left in use. ILS approach." Runway 24 left. The shortest runway at Toronto Pearson, 9,000 feet, or 2,743 meters. Long enough for most aircraft under normal conditions. But the A340 is not most aircraft. It is one of the longest, heaviest airliners ever built, and it was known for needing a generous amount of runway to stop. What the ATIS did not tell the crew, what nobody told them, was why 24 left was the only option. The longer runway 23 had been refused by several aircraft because a storm cell was sitting directly over its approach path, and the parallel runway, 24 right, was out of service because its ILS glide slope antenna had been destroyed by a lightning strike. Flight 358 was being funneled onto the shortest runway, not because it was the best choice, but because it was the only one left. Between 1936 and 1940, the first officer briefed the captain on how he planned to fly the ILS approach to 24 left. The briefing covered the approach procedure, the expected weather, the settings they would use. It did not include the missed approach procedure. It did not include the required landing distance. At any other time, in any other context, this would seem like an inexplicable omission from two highly professional pilots. But Air France at the time simply did not require crews to calculate landing distance before an approach. No procedure mandated it. No checklist prompted it. The pilots had no idea that on a contaminated runway with a tailwind, their A340 would need more than 10,000 feet to stop, over 1,000 feet more than the runway they were about to use. At 1947, the captain picked up the interphone and called the lead purser. He told him about the bad weather ahead. He told him there was a real chance they might have to go around or divert to Ottawa. He told him to make sure the cabin was ready for anything. It was a short call, professional, direct, unhurried. The purser relayed the message to his team, and in that moment, 10 cabin crew members, plus 3 extras who happened to be on board, shifted from routine mode to high alert. They did not know it yet, but in less than 15 minutes, that shift would mean the difference between an orderly evacuation and a catastrophe. As the aircraft descended through the weather, the crew could hear other pilots on the frequency, making a decision that Flight 358 had not yet made, diverting to their alternates. One by one, aircraft were peeling away from Toronto. At 1949, Flight 358 was transferred to the Toronto Tower controller, who began vectoring them toward final approach. The captain requested extended vectors to avoid a large thunderstorm sitting near the center line. Lightning was now striking everywhere around the airport, and one of those strikes knocked out the anemometer, the instrument that feeds wind information to the tower. From this point forward, the only wind data available would come from pilot reports and from the aircraft's own instruments. The tower was flying blind. A regional jet that landed just ahead of them reported the wind as 290 degrees at 15 to 20 knots, a crosswind, shifting away from the headwind the crew had been expecting. It also reported poor braking action until it slowed below 60 knots. The crew of Flight 358 responded by moving their auto brake setting from low to medium. It was an adjustment. It was not enough. As the crew looked out through the windshield, they could see the runway intermittently, a shiny, glass-like surface reflecting the afternoon light, completely covered in water, no grooves cut into the pavement to help it drain. On the navigation display, huge red returns crowded the right side of the screen, pushing in from the northwest. Above the far end of the runway, a massive thunderstorm cloud sat like a dark ceiling, its base lit by constant lightning. The escape route for a missed approach led directly toward it. The aircraft was fully configured and stabilized. Autopilot and auto thrust engaged. Speed locked at 140 knots, 5 above the reference speed of 135 for their landing weight of 185 tons. At 20:01 and 18 seconds, descending through 323 feet, the first officer disconnected the autopilot. 2 seconds later, he disconnected the auto thrust. And in almost the same instant, the wind changed. What had been a crosswind shifted into a tailwind, up to 10 knots pushing from behind. The indicated airspeed dipped. The first officer felt the aircraft sinking. He reacted on instinct, pushing the throttles forward, from 42% engine power to 82%. 4 engines surged. The aircraft, instead of descending along the glide slope, ballooned above it. The speed climbed back up. But now the aircraft had too much energy, too high, too fast, with a tailwind adding to its ground speed. It crossed the runway threshold at 90 feet. The normal crossing height is 50. The captain, monitoring from the left seat, did not call out the deviation. At Air France, only the captain could command a go-around. The first officer could only suggest one. In a situation moving this fast, that distinction mattered. The aircraft plunges into a curtain of rain. Visibility drops to almost nothing. The first officer begins the flare, pulling back to level the aircraft above the runway. But the inputs on his side stick are rapid, sometimes large, fighting turbulence and gusting crosswinds simultaneously. The aircraft levels off at about 25 feet and holds there for 2 seconds. At a ground speed of over 140 knots, those 2 seconds consume hundreds of feet of runway. The thrust levers come back to idle, but the aircraft still has too much energy. It keeps floating. The wheels do not touch pavement. Below them, the runway is a river. Touchdown comes at 20:01 and 53 seconds, 3,800 feet past the threshold. More than 4/10 of the 9,000-foot runway is already behind them. The right main gear is slightly left of center line. The aircraft is crabbed 6 degrees to the right from the crosswind. The spoilers deploy automatically on contact. The first officer applies maximum manual braking and tries to steer back to the center line. But the standard callouts, spoilers up, reversers green, do not come from the captain. The workload, the rain, the lightning, the noise, something in that cascade of inputs breaks the flow. 12.8 seconds pass. Then, reverse thrust is finally selected. Full reverse comes at 16.4 seconds after touchdown. In normal operations, the aircraft flight manual assumes 5 seconds from touchdown to reverse selection. The difference between 5 seconds and 13 seconds on a flooded runway with a tailwind is the difference between stopping and not stopping. The math is finished. There is not enough runway left. At 20:02 and 19 seconds, the Airbus A340 departs the end of runway 24 left at approximately 80 knots, 148 kilometers per hour. It crosses the paved surface, rolls over a service road, smashes through the airport perimeter fence, crosses a road called Convair Drive, and drops into the ravine beyond. The landing gear collapses. A concrete pillar supporting approach lights for the opposite runway is sheared off. The fuel tanks, punctured during the slide across the field, begin leaking. And then the fuel ignites. In the cabin, the overhead bins have burst open, spilling luggage onto passengers. One survivor would later describe the sensation as being in a car crash that just keeps going and going and going. The sequence from runway end to final stop takes 15 to 20 seconds, an eternity. When the aircraft finally comes to rest at the bottom of the ravine, fire is already spreading along the left side. Black smoke pours through an emergency exit, L2, that had somehow opened during the crash. There is no electrical power. The radios are dead. The PA system is dead. The evacuation alert button in the cockpit, when the captain presses it, does nothing. But the cabin crew does not need an alarm. They had been warned. Less than 15 minutes earlier, the captain had called the purser and told him to prepare for anything. That call had rippled through the entire cabin team, elevating every one of them from routine awareness to active readiness. Now, in the smoke and the chaos, that readiness takes over. The lead purser initially tells passengers to stay seated. He does not yet know about the fire. A colleague alerts him within seconds. He orders the evacuation immediately and rushes to inform the captain. Doors are opened, slides deploy, though not all of them. The R3 slide is punctured by debris. The L2 slide fails entirely. The 2 rear left exits are blocked by fire. The crew redirects everyone to the 4 exits that still work. The 3 extra cabin crew members, the ones who were just along for the ride, seated in crew seats by coincidence, jump into action. They help open doors, direct traffic, physically guide passengers toward usable exits. One passenger blocks the aisle trying to retrieve his carry-on bag from an overhead bin, forcing everyone behind him to reroute. The crew handles it. In the control tower, through the driving rain, the controller sees several bright orange flashes as the aircraft crosses the runway end. He activates the crash alarm. The airport fire crew, already watching the landing, is rolling before the alarm finishes sounding. They reach the site within 60 seconds. The first officer, despite being shaken, grabs a flashlight and walks the entire length of the cabin, front to back on one aisle, back to front on the other, checking every seat, every lavatory, making sure no one is left behind. The captain, badly injured with back and head trauma from his seat being wrenched loose on impact, tries to do the same but is forced back by smoke. He exits through the R1 door. The first officer is the last person off the aircraft. All 309 people survive. 12 are seriously injured, 9 from the impact, 3 during the evacuation. The aircraft, within minutes, is consumed entirely by fire. The investigation that followed was led by the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. It confirmed what the numbers had already made obvious. The aircraft touched down too far down the runway, too fast, with too much energy, on a surface that offered almost no braking grip. The thrust reversers were selected far too late, and no one in the cockpit had calculated whether the runway was long enough to stop. But the investigation went deeper than the cockpit. It asked a harder question. Why were these pilots, experienced, professional, well-regarded, ever in a position where this accident could happen? The answers came in layers. Air France had no rule governing how close to a thunderstorm a crew could fly and approach. They had considered one and rejected it. The company did not require landing distance calculations before approach, even in severe weather. The ACARS system had silently failed to deliver a forecast that might have given the crew a clearer picture of what was developing. The handling agent in Toronto knew the airport was under a red alert and did not pass that along because no procedure told him to. The tower's wind instruments were knocked offline by lightning, so the crew was making decisions with stale data, and the shortest runway at the airport had been assigned not because it was suitable, but because every other option had been eliminated by the storm. Each of these was a door that could have closed the path to this accident. Each one stayed open. And then there was the ravine. Runway 24 left ended with a strip of only about 60 meters, followed by a steep drop into Etobicoke Creek. There was no runway end safety area, the 300-meter buffer zone recommended by international standards. The reason there was no safety area was the same reason the ravine was there. The geography made it expensive and complicated to build one. But that geography was not a surprise. It had been a known hazard for decades. Because in 1978, 27 years before Flight 358, another aircraft had crashed into that same ravine. Air Canada Flight 189, a DC-9, suffered a blown tire on takeoff, could not stop, crossed the runway end, and plunged over the embankment into Etobicoke Creek. 2 passengers died. The coroner's inquest that followed made a clear recommendation: install proper runway end safety areas at Canadian airports to prevent exactly this kind of accident from happening again. That recommendation was not implemented. Not in 1978, not in the years that followed, not by the time Flight 358 arrived, 27 years later, at the exact same spot. The ravine was still there, the safety area was still missing, and 309 people went over the edge at 80 knots because the system that was supposed to protect them had heard the warning and done nothing. In the wake of the investigation, changes did come. The TSB recommended that Transport Canada require 300-meter runway end safety areas at all Canadian airports, or, where terrain makes that impossible, the installation of engineered materials arresting systems, known as EMAS. These are beds of crushable concrete placed at the runway end. An aircraft that overruns will sink into the material and decelerate rapidly in a controlled manner, without the catastrophic impact of hitting a ditch or a ravine. Airlines also began tightening their rules around approach procedures in convective weather. Landing distance calculations became mandatory before approach in many carriers. Air France specifically revised its policies to address the very gaps that this accident had exposed. The 3 extra cabin crew members, the ones who boarded Flight 358 as passengers and ended up helping save lives, were later recognized for their actions. The entire cabin crew received praise from investigators, from the airline, and from the passengers they carried out of a burning aircraft in under 90 seconds. The captain's decision to brief the purser about the weather, that one phone call, made from the cockpit while the aircraft was still descending, was cited as a direct contributor to the speed and effectiveness of the evacuation. A single act of communication, so routine it almost did not happen, turned out to be the hinge on which 309 lives turned. Runway 24 left at Toronto Pearson is still there. It is still the shortest runway at the airport, but beyond its end, the landscape has changed. Where there was once just a strip of grass and a drop into a ravine, there is now a system designed to catch what should never have been allowed to fall. 27 years, 2 crashes, same ravine. It took the second one, and a miracle that should never have been necessary, to finally close the door. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps more than you might think. And if you want to know about another accident where a crew faced impossible weather and a runway that was too short, where the outcome was not a miracle, that story is waiting for you right here.